Hello and welcome to Quiz Time. I'm Jess, and today I have a political quiz for you. So, 100 political questions. How do you think you're going to do? Should we find out? Let's go. What 1948 event changed British influence in the Middle East and regional politics drastically? Partition of India, Arab-Israeli War, or Suez Canal crisis? Arab-Israeli War. Which 1950s US senator sparked fear of communist infiltration in government, fueling political paranoia? Lyndon B. Johnson, Joseph McCarthy, or Harry Truman? It was Joseph McCarthy. Which NHS was established in 1948 within the post-war welfare state changes in the UK? Conservative economic revival, Liberal Democratic policy push, or Labour Party's welfare reforms? It was a Labour Party's welfare reforms. What did the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision overturn in the US civil rights movement? State segregation in public schools, housing discrimination, or federal segregation laws in transportation? It was state segregation in public schools. How did the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference reshape international economic relations and post-World War II politics? It created NATO, it ended colonial rule in Africa, or it led to the establishment of the IMF and World Bank? It led to the establishment of the IMF and World Bank. Which political figure's rise in 1960s France stabilised the country and led to the creation of the Fifth Republic Constitution? Charles de Gaulle, François Mitterrand, or Georges Pompidou? Charles de Gaulle. How did NATO's 1949 formation impact Cold War dynamics between the West and Soviet Union? It created a military alliance against communist expansion, it led to the breakup of Warsaw Pact, or it established trade agreements between Europe and USSR? It created a military alliance against communist expansion. How did the Vietnam War impact Cold War tensions and domestic politics in the US and Britain in the 1960s? It led to significant anti-war protests, it triggered NATO intervention, or resulted in increased nuclear arms development? It led to significant anti-war protests. The Voting Rights of Act 1965 aimed to end what discriminatory practice in US politics? Literary tests for voting, poll taxes on middle class, or gender-based voter restrictions? Literacy tests for voting. Which 1945 institution was created after the League of Nations' failure to prevent future conflicts? United Nations, European Union, or International Monetary Fund? United Nations. In the post-World War II period, the Marshall Plan was introduced to achieve what strategic political objective in Europe? Accelerate the decolonialization of Africa, militarize the Western Bloc, or rebuild war-torn economies? Rebuild war-torn economies and prevent communism. What 1962 event nearly triggered nuclear war, heightening Cold War tension? Korean War, Berlin airlift, or Cuban Missile Crisis? It was the Cuban Missile Crisis. What major outcome of the 1949 Chinese Revolution shifted Asia's power balance and influenced Cold War politics? Chinese invasion of Taiwan, China becoming a democracy, or formation of the People's Republic of China? Formation of the People's Republic of China. The US Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned which type of discrimination, shaping political and social dynamics? Age discrimination in political office, religious discrimination, or racial and gender discrimination in jobs and services? racial and gender discrimination in jobs and services. How did the Berlin airlift impact the West's Cold War ties with the Soviet Union? First major Cold War confrontation initiated peaceful negotiations or ended the Soviet blockade of West Berlin. First major Cold War confrontation. What 1968 global event saw clashes between young activists and authorities shaping the New Left movement? Prague Spring, Paris protests, or the Cuban Revolution? Paris protests. The War Powers Act of 1973 in the US Congress was a response to which controversial war's political backlash? Korean War, Vietnam War, or Gulf War? The Vietnam War. In the 1960s, which movement aimed for gender equality in the US, focusing on pay, education, and job opportunities for women? Women's Liberation Movement, Civil Rights Movement, or Labour Rights Movement? Women's Liberation Movement. The 1957 Treaty of Rome established the foundation for which political and economic union that transformed Europe? NATO, Warsaw Pact, or European Economic Community? The European Economic Community, or EEC. Which 1955 conference in Indonesia united Asian and African leaders against colonialization and set the stage for non-aligned movement? Bandung Conference, Cairo Conference, or Geneva Conference? It was the Bandung Conference. The 1966 Cultural Revolution in China aimed to reinforce communist ideology by eliminating capitalist elements. Who led it? Mao Zedong, Zhao Enlai, or Deng Xiaoping? Mao Zedong. Which event in 1947 led to the creation of two independent nations reshaping the political map of South Asia? The partition of India, the independence of Burma, or the founding of Sri Lanka? The partition of India. Israel's 1948 creation led to Mideast conflicts. What group, founded in 1964, became Palestinians' political voice? Hamas, Fatah, or Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO? It was the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. The 1962 UK Immigration Act limited immigration from colonies, responding to which political movement? Political pressure from the United States, rising labour shortages, or growing nationalist and anti-immigration sentiment? Growing nationalist and anti-immigration sentiment. Which African country gained independence from Britain in 1957 under Kwame Nkrumah's leadership, symbolising the post-colonial movement in Africa? Ghana, Nigeria, or Kenya? That's Ghana. The Prague Spring of 1968, a period of political liberalisation in Czechoslovakia, was ultimately crushed by which group of countries? NATO allies, Warsaw Pact nations, or United Nations peacekeeper? Warsaw Pact nations. What 1952 Kenyan uprising triggered decolonialisation and independence, marking the wane of Britain colonial rule in East Africa? Mau Mau uprising, Kikuyu rebellion, or Zulu revolt? Mau Mau uprising. What impact did Lumumba's assassination have on Congo's politics and Cold War relationships? It resulted in a communist government, it led to Congo's alliance in China, or it intensified US and Soviet involvement in African politics. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations, marked a major political commitment to what? Cold War peace efforts, the formation of European Union, or establishing a global human rights net framework. Establishing a global human rights framework. What was the significance of the 1954 Geneva Conference in reshaping the political landscape of Southeast Asia? It divided Vietnam into North and South, it created a democratic system in Laos, or it established a communist government in Cambodia. It divided Vietnam into North and South. Which 1945 meeting planned the post-war political order, including the division of Germany and Europe? Yalta Conference, Tehran Conference, or Potsdam Conference? The Yalta Conference. The 1956 Hungarian Revolution was significant in Cold War politics. What was the outcome? Hungary gained independence, it was crushed by Soviet military forces, or NATO intervened to support Hungary. It was crushed by Soviet military forces. Gamal Abdel Nasser championed which political ideology in the 1950s to unite Arab nations against Western imperialism? Zionism, Pan-Arabianism, or socialism? Pan-Arabianism. Which 1960 event in South Africa escalated global opposition to apartheid? Sharpeville Massacre, Soweto Uprising, or Rivonia Trial? Sharpeville Massacre. During the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel captured territory. Which land did Israel seize? Sinai Peninsula, East Jerusalem, or Lebanon? It was East Jerusalem. The 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion was a failed attempt by the US to overthrow which Cuban leader? Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, or Raul Castro? Fidel Castro. The Berlin Wall in 1961 divided which political ideologies in the Cold War? Nationalism and communism, capitalism and socialism, or democracy and totalitarianism? Capitalism and socialism. What event in 1969 heightened awareness about pollution and conservation during the 1960s? The first Earth Day, the Santa Barbara oil spill, or the establishment of the EPA? The Santa Barbara oil spill. The 1944 GI Bill offered benefits to World War II veterans. Which benefit was excluded? Free healthcare, educational assistance, or unemployment compensation? Free healthcare. After King's 1968 assassination, riots erupted in the US. The federal government implemented what response? It was number 1, the introduction of new anti-riot legislation. The 1968 Tet Offensive was a major event in the Vietnam War. How did it affect US public opinion on the war? It turned public sentiments against the war, it had no significant effect, or it strengthened support for the war efforts. It turned public sentiment against the war. The 1969 Stonewall riots in New York City sparked which major US social movement? Civil rights movement, environmental movement, or LGBTQ+ rights movement? LGBTQ+ rights movement. The 1950s and 1960s activists opposed the Vietnam War using what key strategy? Sit-ins and boycotts, lobbying Congress, or peace marches and protests? Peace marches and protests. In the 1970s, women became more politically engaged. What 1973 Supreme Court decision advanced women's reproductive rights? Roe v. Wade, Griswold v. Connecticut, or Planned Parenthood v. Casey? Roe v. Wade. The creation of the European Economic Community in 1957 aimed to promote economic integration among which nations? Scandinavian countries, Western European nations, or Eastern European countries? The Western European countries. What strategy did the US use during the Cold War to prevent the spread of communism? Detente, containment, or isolation? Containment. The 1964 Civil Rights Act targeted eliminating discrimination based on various factors. What was not included? Equal employment opportunities, desegregation of schools, or protection against housing discrimination? Desegregation of schools. What was the primary purpose of the United Nations establishment in 1945? To promote international trade, control global military power, or to prevent future wars and foster global cooperation? To prevent future wars and foster global cooperation. Leave it to you to see how it's done. The 1967 Detroit riots exposed racial inequality in the US. What caused the unrest? Political corruption, immigration policies, or economic disparity and police brutality? Economic disparity and police brutality. The 1960s counterculture movement was characterized by what key cultural shift? Support for traditional family values, emphasis on material wealth, advocacy for peace and social justice. Advocacy for peace and social justice. Halfway there, how are you doing? What 1954 event escalated the Cold War and drew the US into the Southeast Asia? The fall of Saigon, the Geneva Conference, or the Battle of Dien Bien Phu? The Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The 1964 Freedom Summer aimed to increase voter registration for African Americans in which state? Georgia, Mississippi, or Alabama? It was Mississippi. What UK legislation aimed to abolish the death penalty in 1965, showing a change in societal values? The Criminal Justice Act, the Human Rights Act, or the Murder, Abolition of Death Penalty Act? The clue was in the title, the Murder, Abolition of Death Penalty Act. The establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970 was a response to which major social movement? Labour movement, civil rights movement, or environmental movement? Environmental movement. The establishment of NATO in 1949 was a response to which global concern during the early Cold War? Economic instability, nationalism, or expansion of communism? Expansion of communism. The 1968 assassination of Robert F. Kennedy was a pivotal event in American history. One major consequence was it increased public interest in politics, loss of hope for social change, or a decline of the anti-war movement. Loss of hope for social change. The Freedom Rides in 1961 were aimed at challenging segregation in which area of American life? Education, employment, or public transportation? Public transportation. The term Great Society is associated with which US president and his agenda for social reform? Richard Nixon, Lyndon B. Johnson, or John F. Kennedy? Lyndon B. Johnson. The 1964 Economic Opportunity Act aimed to address which social issue in the United States: poverty, education reform, or racial discrimination? Poverty. The anti-war movement gained momentum following which major US military escalation in Vietnam: Tet Offensive, Fall of Saigo, or Gulf of Tonkin incident? Gulf of Tonkin incident. The 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education ruled that racial segregation in public schools was constitutional, unconstitutional, or acceptable with restrictions. Unconstitutional. The landmark 1976 court case, Craig v. Boren, addressed issues of gender discrimination in what context? Employment, education, or alcohol consumption laws? Alcohol consumption laws. The 1970s economic challenges increased partly due to what factor caused the downturn? Oil crisis and stagflation, technological advancements, or increased military spending? Oil crisis and stagflation. What was a major goal of the women's liberation movement in the 1960s and 70s? Gaining equal pay and employment rights, outlawing the male voting system, or creating exclusive women's political parties? Gaining equal pay and employment rights. The Freedom Summer of '64 is best known for its efforts in which area of social justice? Disregulating public transportation, increasing women's rights, registering African American voters in the South. Registering African American voters in the South. What was the main focus of the Supreme Court's ruling in the landmark 73 case Roe v. Wade? Equal voting rights, legalizing abortion, or limiting presidential power? It was legalizing abortion. What was the goal of the Long March strategy invented by left-wing political movements in the 60s? Corporate boards and private businesses, religious organizations, or cultural institutions, media and education? Cultural institutions, media and education. The Suez Crisis of '56 highlighted the declining influence of which two European powers in the Middle East? France and Germany, Britain and France, or Spain and Italy? Britain and France. What did the students demand during the 1968 Paris protests that influenced global political movements? Better working conditions, higher taxes on corporations, or educational reform and freedom of expression? Educational reform and freedom of expression. The Berlin blockade in 1948 was pivotal in Cold War history. What was the West's response to this Soviet action? They withdrew from Berlin, they began the Berlin airlift, or they launched a counter-blockade? They began the Berlin airlift. Malcolm X's 1965 assassination was a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement. What was his main focus then? Integration of African Americans into white society, self-defense and black nationalism, or full collaboration with government? Self-defense and black nationalism. What was one of the main outcomes of the '72 Watergate scandal that rocked American politics? President Nixon's resignation, the end of the Vietnam War, or the passage of new tax laws? President Nixon's resignation. The term Iron Curtain, used during the Cold War, referred to which of the following? A series of secret military bases in Europe, a physical wall dividing Europe, or the divide between the Soviet bloc and the West? The divide between the Soviet bloc and the West. What major 1960s movement featured non-violent protests against the Vietnam War and sparked anti-war demonstrations worldwide? The peace movement, the civil rights movement, or the women's liberation movement? The peace movement. In 1953, the Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh was overthrown in a coup orchestrated by which two foreign nations, USA and USSR, USA and the UK, or France and the USSR? It was USA and the UK. In 1956, which Middle Eastern leader nationalised the Suez Canal, leading to military intervention by Britain, France and Israel? Gamal Abdel Nasser, Anwar Sadat, or King Hussein? Gamal Abdel Nasser. The Treaty of Rome, signed in 1957, laid the foundation for which significant political and economic union in Europe? The United Nations, the European Union, or the Warsaw Pact? The European Union. What was the goal of the Great Green Revolution in the 1970s in India and Latin America? Military development, agricultural production, or industrial manufacturing? Agricultural production. What group of nations was united by the Bandung Conference of 1955 during the Cold War? European communist states, Latin American socialist states, or newly independent nations in Africa and Asia? Newly independent nations in Africa and Asia. Patrice Lumumba's 1961 assassination caused political instability in which African country after independence? Congo, Nigeria, or Kenya? Congo. Which militant organisation advocated for African American rights during the late 1960s Black Power movement in the US? Black Panthers, NAACP, or Freedom Riders? Black Panthers. What region did the US use the domino theory to justify fighting communism during the 1950s and 60s? South America, Southeast Asia, or Eastern Europe? Southeast Asia. What 1956 event in Eastern Europe sparked the first uprising against Soviet control, met with a harsh military reaction? Hungarian Revolution, Prague Spring, or Polish Solidarity Movement? Hungarian Revolution. In 1960, 17 African countries gained independence from European colonial powers, with this event being referred to as what? The African Spring, the Year of Africa, or the decolonialization era? The Year of Africa. What 1965 political shift in Indonesia resulted in a mass anti-communist purge and brought General Suharto to power? Jakarta Uprising, 30 September Movement, or Bandung Uprising? 30 September Movement. During the 70s, which country experienced the Carnation Revolution, marking the end of its authoritarian regime? Spain, Portugal, or Greece? That was Portugal. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, was designed to help which region recover economically after World War II? Latin America, Eastern Europe, or Western Europe? Western Europe. Which Latin American leader was ousted in a US coup in 1973, ushering in a military dictatorship? That was number 1, Salvador Allende of Chile. Established in 1955, the Warsaw Pact was formed in response to which organisation? NATO, the European Union, or the United Nations? NATO. Which American university sparked the 1960s free speech movement, leading to nationwide student protests? Harvard University, Columbia University, or University of California, Berkeley? University of California, Berkeley. What 1968 French movement involved student protests and strikes that almost toppled the government? May 68 movement, Paris Commune, or the French Spring? May's 68 movement. Clue in the title. What British movement in the 1950s advocated for nuclear disarmament, opposing Cold War militarisation? The British Labour Movement, the Green Party, or Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND? The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND. The 1968 Tet Offensive turned the Vietnam War. Who launched surprise attacks on US and South Vietnamese forces? US Special Forces, South Vietnamese Army, or North Vietnamese and Viet Cong? North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. In 1954, the US launched Operation Wetback to address what issue along its southern border? Drug smuggling, trade disputes with Latin America, or undocumented immigration from Mexico? Undocumented immigration from Mexico. The 1968 Cultural Revolution, radical students enforced policies against intellectuals and bourgeois elements. What were these students called? Mao's Guards, the Red Guards, or the People's Army? The Red Guards. Which treaty signed in 1968 aimed to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and promote peaceful nuclear energy use? The Geneva Accords, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the Paris Peace Agreement? The Non-Proliferation Treaty. What event in 1967 led to a military conflict between Israel and neighbouring Arab countries, resulting in Israel's territorial expansion? The Yom Kippur War, the Six-Day War, or the Lebanon Crisis? The Six-Day War. What African-American athlete raised a fist in protest at the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City? Muhammad Ali, Tommie Smith, or Jackie Robinson? Tommie Smith. In 1958, Charles de Gaulle returned to power in France and established which republic? Fourth Republic, Fifth Republic, or Sixth Republic? Fifth Republic. And your last one. What significant legal decision did the US Supreme Court make in the Miranda v. Arizona case of 1966? Rights to equal pay, rights of public protesters, or right to remain silent and have a lawyer? Right to remain silent and have a lawyer. So, how did you do today? Drop your score in the comments below, and of course like and subscribe so you get notified every time we post a new quiz. And please join us next time on Quiz Time.